Now, from Atlanta News First, the issues that matter to you. This is On the Record.
U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson, the congressional Republican from Louisiana, who is also just happens to be one of the most powerful and influential lawmakers in the United States, is likely breathing a small sigh of relief on Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025, as a very hotly contested, very interesting special election for a Tennessee congressional seat has once again been held by Republicans, but not by a very large margin. This is On the Record with Atlanta News First for Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025. I'm Tim Darnell, happy as always to be joined by my friend and colleague and the host of On the Record with Atlanta News First every Sunday at 11 a.m., Rick Folbaum. Rick, before we talk about what happened in Tennessee, and that was a race that was being watched by a lot of very influential Democrats and Republicans and both parties, and likely by the White House itself, I want to turn to some of the local election runoffs that we had last night. We are in a never-ending election season, and if you enjoy going to the polls, guess what, guys? We're only getting started. We have the 2026 midterms coming up. But last night, Tuesday, we had several municipal elections, some Atlanta City Council runoffs, some Atlanta Board of Education runoffs, and 4 metro Atlanta cities were going to the polls to either elect or re-elect their mayors. We are talking about the city of Roswell has a new mayor by a very narrow margin. The city of East Point, their current mayor was re-elected. Sandy Springs, Rusty Paul, I know that was a race that you were kind of following. He was very easily re-elected. And in South Fulton, arguably Georgia's newest municipality, they elected their 3rd mayor in only 8 years. That is a city that had just undergone a lot of turmoil since their citizens, the good people of South Fulton, voted to incorporate 8 years ago.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and again, these are runoff elections because during the original vote that took place last month in November, no candidate got 50% plus one, which would have meant an outright victory. And so the top 2 vote getters in those races, and you mentioned some of them, they went head-to-head yesterday. Let's start with the city of South Fulton because they have their very first female mayor-elect. Carmelita Gumbs is going to become the first female mayor of that young city. And, of course, she comes on board after a real tumultuous several years with Mayor Khalid Kobe Kamau, whose administration was racked with allegations of misuse of taxpayer dollars and other allegations. And so he didn't receive anywhere near the number of votes to be able to take part in yesterday's runoff. Gumbs faced off against Dr. Mark Baker, but she beat him handedly, and she will become, as of January 1st, when she's sworn in, the new mayor of South Fulton. She is promising a lot more transparency, and she is trying to restore, she says, the public's trust in the city government there in that young city. Another race that we were following closely was the mayoral contest in Sandy Springs, of course, a big suburb city in and of itself, north of Atlanta, where Rusty Paul, the incumbent mayor, was running for his 4th term. And this was interesting because in the general election in November, he faced off against 3 other opponents. And if you had taken the totals of those 3 other opponents and added them together, they beat the percentage of votes that Rusty Paul received in the general election. And so the thinking was that if the candidate, the number 2 candidate here in this case, Dante Carter, if he could get the support of those 2 other candidates who were running with him against Rusty Paul, and sort of gotten that whole coalition together, he might have been able to beat Rusty Paul, but at the end of the day, he came nowhere close. The incumbent mayor, who has a long history in city government, as the formerly sat on the city council of Stone Mountain, he was the former chair of the Republican Party here in Georgia for a number of years, and he's been the mayor of Sandy Springs, only the second mayor in that city's history, and he will now serve a fourth term. People in Sandy Springs pretty happy, evidently, according to the polls anyway, with the direction that Mayor Paul has taken that city in. And you mentioned a couple of other races that we've been watching here. No real upsets. One real change, I guess, and that is the city of Roswell will have a brand new mayor as a result of yesterday's elections. The incumbent mayor in that city was voted out of office, and there will be a new mayor in Roswell come the beginning of the year. So those are the local races that everybody was keeping a close eye on.
When you look at the history of Sandy Springs and South Fulton and some of the other fairly new metro Atlanta cities, for most of the latter part of the 20th century, we had a very strong Democratic Party control of both the State House and the State Senate. Really, in the late 1990s, heading into the early 2000s, we saw Republicans taking control not only of both chambers under the Gold Dome at Atlanta, but also the governor's mansion. And that really began paving the way or laying a little bit more of political support for the idea of municipalization. We saw for many years Dunwoody and Sandy Springs were fighting in the late 90s while the legislature was under Democratic Party control to become more involved in their own self-government. Now we have Dunwoody, Sandy Springs. Those are the two cities that really were the first to incorporate in the early 2000s. Then we have Johns Creek, Brookhaven, where I live, and now the city of South Fulton. But Sandy Springs and South Fulton, they've kind of taken divergent paths to becoming a city because Sandy Springs, Dunwoody, others had some very stable leadership, and their citizens were very much of a mind that they wanted their own form of self-government. South Fulton is obviously the same, but South Fulton has just been plagued by, almost since its very beginning. Take us through the challenges of what it takes to actually become your own municipal entity.
Well, it's a really tricky thing, and it's almost a little bit like careful what you wish for, because a lot of these municipalities, it starts off, there's a groundswell of support for becoming their own independent city, because that way they would be able to collect and keep all of the tax revenue that comes in. They would have more say and control over public utilities, over schools, over all kinds of things, property taxes and the like. But what happens sometimes is that once these areas do get control, they find that they really can't handle all of the logistics of
and there are
making,
personality conflicts.
Yes, personality conflicts, managerial, problems and the like. And so a lot of times what we see is that these young cities that come in to their independence with such hope and promise end up running into some problems when it comes to the day-to-day grind of actually collecting the trash, for example. And so these are some of the issues that the people of South Fulton have dealt with. I think that bringing in leaders and electing leaders who have not necessarily lived up to their promise, is another problem as well. And that's certainly, not something that is specific to these municipalities, but it is something that they've had to deal with. And we mentioned Mayor Kobe, as he prefers to be called. You take a look at some of the controversy that has swirled around his time in office, and I really think that that Carmelita Gumbs, the new mayor-elect there, she really has her work cut out for her to try to portray a much more competent level, transparent level of governance. than the outgoing administration was able to provide for the people of South Fulton. She comes into office now with a lot of work on her plate, but she says she's ready. She's up to the task, and of course, we'll be following her once she is sworn in the first of the year.
We will be following her on Atlanta News First as we now turn our attention to a congressional race just to the north of Georgia, our neighboring state of Tennessee.
Right.
There was a special election held on Tuesday, December 2nd, for a vacant congressional seat representing much of metropolitan Nashville. The incumbent had stepped down, and the special election was underway, and it was a wide open race. This is a seat that had been held by Republicans for many years that had voted very solidly in favor of former President Donald Trump, now President Donald Trump, in his quest last year to reclaim the White House. The president carried this district very handily, and yet it was a much tighter race than a lot of political observers may have thought for. Republican Matt Von Epps is the newest member of Congress, defeating Democrat Afton Bain by less than 10 points. I think it was by about a 9-point margin. And yet this is a district in a solid red state, solid red district, and yet the latest example of a Democrat perhaps overperforming and perhaps setting a tone for the 2026 midterms. We know that's 11 months away. We also know that special elections are not necessarily the most accurate indicator or precursor of what we can expect. But nonetheless, it was a very interesting race.
It really was. I mean, and the question is, when is a loss a win? And I think
Right.
that's what a lot of people are asking this morning. And you mentioned overperform, underperform, expectations. These are all words that political analysts throw around because, going into elections, there are certain, sort of underlying realities that really sort of hold true, especially for certain geographical areas where a particular district has traditionally voted for a Republican candidate or for a Democratic candidate. And this was a district, as you said, that was very heavily in support of President Trump. He won the district by 22 points only a year and a half ago. And so the question was, is the Republican candidate in this race going to be able to match that kind of support? Or has some of that support for Republican policies, for the president's agenda, has that sort of diminished a little bit, and will that be reflected in the vote totals? And that's exactly what happened. And this builds off of some of the Democratic victories that we saw in November in races that took place in Virginia and New Jersey, the gubernatorial races in those states where the Democrats really overperformed in a lot of ways and gave Democrats hope heading into next year's midterm elections. Even though they lost this race in Tennessee, a lot of Democrats are actually cheering the results because it did show that they've made a lot of headway in this traditionally Republican district of Tennessee, and the hope is for Democrats that they'll be able to use that as a model in other races around the country, especially in Republican held areas, traditionally Republican districts. Will they be able to make enough inroads to potentially win back control of the House of Representatives? And that, of course, is the big goal for Democrats heading into the midterms. We know that traditionally speaking, historically speaking, the party that is not in power, meaning that does not have the president, tends to do better in midterm elections. That's not a rule, but it's the way that it's gone historically. And so a lot of people have been looking to the Democrats to do well in next year's midterms. And all signs are pointing to that being, in fact, the case. Will it be enough for them to win enough seats to win back a majority in the House of Representatives? That remains to be seen. But certainly this race that you mentioned that we're talking about here was one that was very widely watched, and there were a lot of Republicans who were very concerned that perhaps the Democrat was going to be able to pull out a victory here. At the end of the day, she was not able to do that, but she lost by such a small margin that it still gives Republicans, it still gives Democrats rather, some hope that this is a sign of good things to come as we head into the 2026 calendar and the midterm elections, where every single member of the House of Representatives will be up for re-election. That happens every single cycle. Senators, the Senate races are the terms are for 6 years, and so they're a bit staggered, but every time there's an election, the members of the House of Representatives have to defend their seats, and we'll see, because there are, if you look at the president's approval numbers nationally, they are down. Americans not happy with the direction of the economy, not happy with some of the president's policies when it comes to the immigration crackdown, people saying that they think that perhaps the president's policies are going a bit too far. They've seen some of the images on the streets of some of the ICE raids, and people have been upset about some of that. They also go to the grocery store and buy food for their families, and they see how their grocery bills are still higher than they want them to be. The question on the issue of affordability, that was sort of the magic word. We heard at the president's cabinet meeting yesterday, he tried to sort of downplay the issue of affordability. He said it's a scam, that this is something that the Democrats are trying to play up for political purposes to try to win support. And you know what? I think that he's right in the fact that the Democrats are trying to play it up. I don't know whether it's a scam or not, but he does run the risk here of running into the same kind of problems that President Biden ran into during his presidency, when voters saw him as not being in touch with some of the challenges that they were facing, economically speaking, that he was not in touch with their reality here, what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And if President Trump doesn't acknowledge the fact that there is an affordability crisis and that his administration does need to do more to solve it, that's something that could come back to haunt him and his Republican colleagues as we head towards this next election cycle.
And we're talking about President Trump and some of the crises and challenges and controversies surrounding his brand new, or not, shouldn't say brand new, we're coming up into the 11th month, almost the first year very soon, of the 47th president's White House administration. The other issue that he's facing is more of an international issue, but it does have some domestic repercussions, as we're seeing some Republican senators beginning to question the administration's policies of carrying out lethal strikes on suspected drug running boats running out of Venezuela. And the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and the President seem to be kind of getting their wires a little bit crossed as far as what public message they're sending out. This is obviously a military issue as well. Did the White House and did the Secretary of Defense know or authorize a second strike on a suspected drug cartel boat that reportedly killed any survivors from a previous attack? Rick, Georgia has such a long history of senators who have been real titans in terms of the issue of national defense. Congressman Carl Vinson from the mid-20th century, U.S. Senator Sam Nunn from the latter part of the 20th century was, these are giant names when it comes to America's military preparedness and the state of our national defense. We haven't heard anything from Senators Ossoff or Warnock that I'm aware of. Tell us a little bit, frame this issue for us, exactly what's been going on over the past couple of weeks on this issue.
Sure. So this is all about a military strike that took place in September, where the U.S. military has been conducting operations. This is one in particular, though, where an alleged drug smuggling boat was targeted and struck by the U.S. military in an attempt to stop what the Trump administration alleges were drug traffickers from making their way onto U.S. shores. The administration has taken the stance that this is a wartime effort to stop an invasion of drug smugglers that have been sending their products into the United States, causing death and destruction that really no one can deny. But what is debatable are the tactics that have been used here. The administration has not provided any kind of evidence that these boats are in fact doing what they say that they're doing, which is smuggling drugs, but they have gone after them. And this particular strike in September went after one of these boats, and the issue was that after the initial strike on the boat, that they were able to determine that there were two survivors, two people on board the boat who had not been killed in the initial strike. And so a second strike was carried out, which then claim the lives of those two people who had survived the initial strike. And of course there is military law both here in this country and internationally that you do not strike any wounded, anybody that you're going after who has already been wounded in battle. Those who have been wounded are supposed to be rescued and then given medical attention. Of course, these are again international rules, but that also exist here in the United States as well, just as a regular sort of code of war and military conduct. And so was that broken when this second strike was carried out, and these two survivors were then targeted again and killed. And who ordered that second strike? That really is what it comes down to.
We don't know. There are conflicting signals.
We don't know. At this point, we don't know. But you have to believe that there are very clear records, very clear, probably even recordings of the communication between the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, and the military commander who was in charge of that operation, someone by the name of Vice Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley. He was then the commander of Joint Special Operations Command. And he is now the one that the administration is saying called for that second strike, except that there were reports last Friday, right after Thanksgiving, that a lot of people may have missed because of the holiday. The Washington Post broke the story that, in fact, it was Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary himself, who ordered that second strike. And so, if that is the case, did he commit a war crime? And this is not a partisan issue. We have Republicans and Democrats, both, who have raised questions about this, raised concerns about this, and who have now promised congressional investigations into this military strike. Strike 1 and Strike 2 on this particular occasion of September 2nd. And so we're going to be finding out exactly what happened as lawmakers bring people in for testimony. Unclear right now whether this will be public and whether we'll get to watch and listen as these players are questioned by lawmakers, or whether we'll just get reports of it after the fact. But lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have promised to get to the bottom of it. The White House is standing firm behind Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Pete Hegseth himself now is saying that he walked out of the Situation Room after the first strike and was not even there to witness and to even be aware of the fact that there was a second strike taking place. But we'll see what happens, because it's very clear, at least as far as these media reports go, that someone inside the Pentagon, at least one person and maybe more, have leaked to the Washington Post and CNN, those are the two main news organizations behind this reporting, that it was Hegseth himself who called for that second attack, using the words, quote, "kill them all," as his instructions to the military commanders in charge. And if that was the case, exactly what happens here, I think that in other administrations and other times, something like that might be enough for a president to say, you know what, let's move on to a new Secretary of Defense. This person is more trouble than he's worth to our administration, causing more controversy. But that's not really the way President Trump operates. When members of his administration have come under attack for saying or doing certain things, he has really, in most cases, at least in this second term, has stood by them and really dug in his heels in terms of supporting them. And so we'll see what happens here. It'll be very interesting to see what these congressional hearings turn up. But again, it seems pretty clear that there are people inside the Pentagon who wanted the public to know their side of this story, which was that Hegseth was responsible. We don't know exactly who those people are, those sources who spoke to journalists about this, but clearly there is some feeling on the inside of the Pentagon among some of the rank and file that perhaps Pete Hegseth has overstepped his authority here, made a mistake, and that he shouldn't be placing the blame on the military commanders, but rather taking the blame himself. So we'll see how that all plays out.
It's a bipartisan issue, as you said, and you kind of have to wonder. A couple of weeks ago, when I believe there were 6 Democratic congressional lawmakers, I can't recall if they were senators and representatives or only senators, who recorded the infamous video where they were saying that if you're a member of the military, you have an obligation not to carry out an order that you think is illegal. You wonder whether or not if that's what they were referring to when this video was circulated.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that, but you're right. I mean, I think it does raise that question, and those Democrats who recorded that video came under fire and continue to come under fire. In fact, at one point, President Trump saying that they were guilty of sedition and treason, which of course is punishable by death, which the president also mentioned in his social media posts. We know that one of those lawmakers, Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, who was a former, he flew over Iraq and Afghanistan. He flew up in space as an astronaut. He was one of those senators, one of those lawmakers who took part in that recording, and he now is receiving threats as a result of the president coming out and saying that what he did was treasonous. And so when they came out and recorded that, and they talked about illegal orders and that the military, members of the military have an obligation to not follow what they consider to be illegal orders, perhaps this is what they were referring to, an illegal order on the part of the defense secretary. And again, we don't know this at this point that this is the case, but an illegal order on the part of the defense secretary to carry out a military operation where they killed everybody on board of this ship, whether it took 1 or 2 military strikes. That does sort of go to, if true, that does speak to what those Democratic senators and members of Congress were referring to when they talked about illegal orders that should not be followed.
Today is Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025, and you've been watching and listening to On the Record with Atlanta News First, our midweek podcast where we take a look at some of the local, state, national, and even international issues that are making headlines across the American political spectrum. A reminder always to watch On the Record with Atlanta News First every Sunday at 11 a.m. on Atlanta News First, hosted by my friend and colleague Rick Folbaum and our outstanding political reporter, Doug Reardon. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of On the Record with Atlanta News First.
Thank you for watching ANF Plus. For more breaking news, live coverage, and your community stories, download the Atlanta News First app. You can also watch us on YouTube, Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. To join the conversation on YouTube Live, visit our channel and hit subscribe. You can also listen to the Atlanta News First podcast by searching Atlanta News First on your preferred listening platform.